Welcome to the Center for U.S. War Veterans Oral Histories at the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey in Seagirt, a partner of the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project. Today is October 23, 2015. I am Carol Fowler, Director of the Center. My honored veteran is Dr. Michael Mittelmann, who served in the Vietnam War with the United States Army Medical Corps. He served from 1957 to 1967 and 1983 to 1995, both active and reserve duty. He served as an orthopedic surgeon in the 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang, the Republic of Vietnam, from March of 1965 until March of 1966. Then he was at the U.S. Army Hospital in West Point, New York. He also served at 340th General Hospital and the 819th Station Hospital. Later in his Army Reserve career, he was with the 804th Medical Brigade. Thank you for wanting to be here today, Dr. Mittelmann. May I call you Michael?
Sure.
Thank you. Your eyewitness account is considered a primary historical source and a valuable contribution to our Veteran Oral History Project here at the National Guard Militia Museum. And good morning and welcome.
Thank you.
Tell me how you heard about my project.
I was here with the American Legion Post 529, not far from here, and we had a tour of the museum, guided tour, and a very nice visit, and that's when I heard about the Oral History Project.
Oh, thank you so much for signing up. So take me back to life prior to service. Had anyone in your family served before you? And let me just distinguish, you're a retired colonel.
That's correct.
Okay, I'm sorry I left that out. Oh wait, I do have it on my thing. Okay. Who served in your family before you?
Well, the real key person was an uncle that I always looked up to and admired, and he was during World War II in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and was a flight engineer traveling all over North Africa and the South Pacific. And I always kind of thought well of what he did. And when the opportunity arose, I decided that's what I was going to do.
So you enlisted?
Well, I was an intern at a hospital in New York.
Right.
And as life of an intern is kind of a busy one, I got to meet some of the residents who were at a higher level of training than I was. And they were in the Army Reserve. And they did a good recruiting job because they said, why don't you come down to visit the unit that we're in, which was a General Hospital Reserve unit in Manhattan. And I went for a number of visits with them and actually went ahead and joined the reserve at that time. That's how I got started.
You were in Manhattan. That's what is considered your location in the reserve?
That was where this Reserve General Hospital was located at the time, and we went to meetings there, like the typical reserve meeting might have been on a Monday night or a Wednesday night or whatever, and I was able to get some time off from the hospital to join them, and it was very appealing to me, so I applied at that time. During my internship, I applied for a residency in the Army instead of going on in a civilian residency, which I could have done.
Right.
I decided to sign on the dotted line, and I got approved after interviews and so forth. I got approved for the orthopedic residency program at Brook General Hospital in San Antonio.
Oh, okay.
So that's how I got well on the way after that.
You had a family at the time? A wife?
Yes.
And you were only making $50 a month?
Just about that, right.
And you were working all kinds of hours as an intern?
Right.
So I think that was a wonderful decision. And I'm so happy that someone inspired you to do that.
It got us out of the middle of Manhattan. Hospital for Joint Diseases was up on 123rd and Madison Avenue. We lived down on 72nd Street in a 5-flight walk-up brownstone little townhouse, and hauling the little baby up and down the stairs was getting kind of tedious for her.
Wow.
While I was working, and the Army program was an exciting opportunity, and that's got me going from then on.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
And also, like you said, you're in the middle of Manhattan. I can't imagine what the cost was to live there.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
With very limited hospital benefits at that time for salary. Yeah.
And did the Army help you with any of your education costs?
Well, what happens with the residency program in the military is that, of course, you get the full pay of what rank you go in as, and I went in as a captain for that residency program. During the reserve time in Manhattan at the Reserve General Hospital, I was a lieutenant, but once I got commissioned into the regular program, then I was a captain. But I didn't have tuition assistance as a necessity based on my medical school requirements. That was not a problem. Okay. So the main thing was I got housing, I got the place to live, and I got a decent living wage, so that worked out good.
Good for you.
Yeah.
What about any kind of boot camp, weapons training?
Well, I've gone to, and I probably will end up having to refer to some of my little cheat sheets and notes that I have. But I've had a number of schools in training in addition to just the medical surgical aspect of it. And I did have basic medical corps training camp down in San Antonio. Well-known place to some people is known as Camp Bullis, Bullis, and that's where you learn land navigation, how to get around with a compass, how to use firearms and things like that. So that's the basic that I had as a medical
How
corps.
did you do with the firearms and the compass? How'd you do with all that?
Well, I did well.
What kind of firearms?
Well, we had the automatic weapons, and we also had the 45 caliber pistol.
Machine guns?
Which I like.
Automatic weapons, is that a machine gun?
Well, it's a rifle with a nice clip in it, so you hear a lot more about that now.
And also we should say that you didn't want Navy or ships.
Right. No, I just...
Wanted to be on land.
Right, I like to have my feet on the ground. But.
All right, so in the fall of '57, you were with the 307th General Hospital?
Correct.
Where was that?
That was in Manhattan.
Okay.
Actually, it was in the 40s, about 40, I forget the street, but between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue. Nice neighborhood.
And did you move to another place in Manhattan so she wouldn't have to walk up the 5 flights?
No. We stayed there till the end of my civilian internship, and then we moved to, well, we had several moves, but we eventually moved to Fort Bragg.
Okay.
That's where I had 1 year of general surgery at the hospital at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
She didn't come with you to San Antonio?
Yes, she did, as a matter of fact. We got temporary housing for the 4 to 6 weeks that I was assigned there. Yeah, everything went very smoothly, and we had the one child, so it was easy to get around.
Leading up into the Korean War, you were exempt from service, and then you went on to medical school?
That's correct. In 1953, I started medical school.
You were at NYU?
For undergraduate school, yes.
So now a regular commissioned officer rather than a reserve commission, but still a lieutenant?
When I started the actual the training program, I was a captain. So that's...
Okay. And you You applied for Army Residency Program at Governor's Island, New York?
Right.
Is that,
At
okay.
that time, there was a Army facility there for, I guess I had an interview there, and not sure if I had my physical exam there, but yeah, we had to take the ferry out there.
And then Army Medical Service School was basic school?
Yes,
Where was that?
in San Antonio.
Oh, okay. And 1958, Fort Sam Houston? Yeah, and I read you took your wife and son. Fort Sam Houston, is that San Antonio?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a military base in San Antonio, Texas.
Different from Camp Bullis?
And Camp Bullis is out in what some would characterize as the boonies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's scrub brush and sand and dirt and rocks and things like that. So it's not part of Fort Sam Houston, which is a historical base for San Antonio, and a very large one.
Is it 100 years old or over that?
I'm not sure of how far back it goes right now, but I would guess that could well be.
So what kind of adjustment was it for you to go to the South? You always grew up, you were from, you're a Yankee.
We were right up in the middle in New York City.
Right.
The adjustment was, I don't really think back on it as having been much of a problem for adjustment. We had the school there, the military field service school, and then we moved up to Fort Bragg. And I guess the only thing is it's a little tough to get used to the moving around,
Okay.
but we did. And the problem up at Fort Bragg was there was no post housing. We didn't live on the base, and we ended up in a little, like a condo complex, but it was a little bit of a drive to get to the hospital there. But the adjustment was not all that complex and not all that difficult. There were other military families living in this housing area, like some helicopter pilots and other people, which we didn't really associate with too much.
Oh, I see.
We did our thing, but not. It was more of get-togethers with hospital people.
That
Not
makes
the
sense.
helicopter pilots, but
That makes sense.
yeah.
And what was going on at the time? Not the Cuban Missile Crisis yet, right? Or it was?
You'll have to remind me of the, I'd have to kind of think of the dates, but it's interesting that you ask about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I had a granddaughter who was doing a project at school, at the university, and she asked me about what we were doing, what was our feeling during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And this is I'm just trying to correlate the dates now, I don't want to mix that
It
up.
was in the early 60s. President Kennedy, it was before, I think it was 1960 or 61.
Yeah.
Because after that was the Berlin Wall crisis.
I don't recall, the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't involve us at
Oh, okay.
at Fort Bragg. It was
Okay.
later on, I think. I have to kind of check the calendar there. But if I can continue that one little link there with the Cuban Missile Crisis, she asked me about it, and I think we were at Fort Belvoir at the time in Virginia. And the idea was we were very close to Washington, D.C.
Right.
So they were wondering, well, what was the reaction and what was the feeling about the Cuban Missile Crisis while we were that close to Washington? The idea that someone would be scared if there was going to be a problem with missiles flying around.
Right.
And I said, quite frankly, we were so busy at the hospital doing our day-to-day clinics and orthopedic rounds and conferences, and I had no recollection at all of my wife, Suzanne, of her concern, and there wasn't a lot of humming around, well, let's be careful of this and that. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was, from my perspective, was pretty quiet.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. That kind of reminds me of what other veterans say. They were too busy doing their job to think about home and foreign policy and things like that.
Right, and the other thing is, unless the hospital or the unit, whether it's an infantry unit or a parachute, airborne unit, unless you're mobilized, unless you're told at the hospital, be ready for this,
Right.
and be ready for casualties and doing all that, you're going to go about your usual chores, your usual duties. So,
Of course. All right, so 1 year at Womack Army Hospital for surgical training, and then orthopedic surgery, Brooke General
was
Hospital.
back down to.
Back down to
Right.
Houston. How did your wife feel about moving back there?
Well, actually, San Antonio was a pretty nice community. We liked that, and there we did have post housing, so we didn't have to run around looking for a home somewhere where to go,
I see.
and that worked out.
And this time you were there for 3 years?
Right, that's correct.
Okay.
And we had our second son born at Fort Bragg, so we had him along for the ride this time. Instead of only traveling to San Antonio with one son, this time we traveled with 2 sons.
You drove?
Right, we were driving back and forth all the time.
Oh, really? You didn't fly?
I beg your pardon?
Why didn't you fly?
Well, because you can pack everything you can in the car.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
And the government moved, the government had transportation for all the household stuff, so.
That's good.
So we got to see a little of the country as well,
Nice.
which worked out well.
And then was Fort Belvoir.
That was after the orthopedic residency program. So I was assigned to the Army Hospital at Fort Belvoir as an orthopedic surgeon. Prior to that, I was in training for 3 years. By the way, the system at the time, and I can't exactly say what they're doing today, when we sign on the dotted line for the residency, 4 years, 1 year of surgery and then 3 years of orthopedics, there's a commitment of 1 year for every year of the residency program. So I had a 4-year commitment to remain in the military following the residency training program. So my first assignment after training was, it was called DeWitt Army Hospital at Fort Belvoir. And that was a very good assignment.
Why?
Well, it was a very interesting location to be assigned to. We were practically around the corner from Mount Vernon for historical activities going on. And then we had some affiliation with consultants from Washington, D.C. So we would have somebody visit us who happened to be an expert in, let's say, hand surgery or something else. We also had opportunities to visit the Naval Hospital in Bethesda. So it was a very active community to be involved in a profession.
Okay. Military program had a lot of interaction with the civilian community. There's some very excellent research at the veterans facilities for prosthetics and devices, assisted devices for impairments like amputations. Was that in Texas?
In Texas, yes. We had more involvement with veterans there than on the active duty post in Fort Belvoir. There might have been some veterans coming in the clinic there, but it was mainly down in San Antonio that we had the opportunity to see and take care of veterans. And of course, if you're looking in the time frame of 1958 to 1962, a number of the majority of the veterans were then World War II or Korean veterans. So I think that was an important part of the program that we had there.
Can you describe some of the cases that you saw? What mostly stands out? Or who mostly stands out?
I don't know that, I think probably, well, one area that I think you just touched on a minute ago might have been the involvement in the Amputee Clinics, where we would see veterans with various levels of lower extremity or upper extremity amputation. And periodically we would see a veteran, maybe from even, I don't recall whether it would have been World War I or whatever, but some would come in with some prosthetics, artificial limbs that were almost I would put in the category of antiques. Wow. Because they were using some old device that maybe never bothered to come in to get anything done.
Wow.
So that made it kind of interesting to see that.
Like a wooden leg?
Well, yeah, there would have been.
Like Captain
It's hard
Hook?
to characterize it right now, but compared with the prosthetics that you're seeing on television today with the fiber, carbon, and electronic assistive devices, that wasn't in existence then.
Would they have like a hook for a hand?
Right, that's right.
And that's antique?
Well, you remember I'm talking 1958 to 1962, so we're a long way from that time till now.
Mm-hmm. So you would switch it out?
I'm using the term like antique only in the idea that some would come in with appliances and devices that were pretty old. So to us as young, hotshot residents down there looking for everything that we can find, that's what we did see from some of the veterans.
You were seeing relics?
Yeah, that's another good museum pieces. Well, they would be now anyway.
So
and so that would be one category of.
And what would you do? Switch them out with a newer prosthetic?
Right. That we had a very active association with the rehab department at the hospital, and there would be a combined conference between our orthopedic residents and those in the rehabilitation department. So we were actively kind of communicating and working with them. So some of the prescriptions were done in conjunction with the rehab department.
So I imagine that you got to see quite a bit of gratification and happiness and success for these poor veterans from World War I when you could improve, or Korea, and you could improve their situation.
I don't have a recall at the moment about
anyone in particular.
Emotional reaction. I think, but we would see others where there might have been a tumor, a bone tumor, or we were talking before about somebody with chronic back pain. So there were other issues other than just prosthetics and amputation problems.
Okay. And you also said the courses taken as well as the training was very excellent preparation for whatever you went on to do later on in your career.
I feel that way. It turns out that when you're in a program like a training program that takes anywhere from 1 to 3 years or more, 2 or more of those residents who were the senior people in that program were veterans themselves of Korea or even World War II. So one of those particular veterans that, I call him a veteran, but he was a senior resident, and I think he was a major at the time. It turns out that a lot of his experiences were passed on to many of us as kind of junior residents. You know, here's what we did where I was in the field hospital in Vietnam. And it turns out that I ended up in Vietnam at the hospital where one of the senior residents that I had in training had been 2 or 3 years earlier. So it made it a really great association as far as I was concerned. I mean, to go to the same place he had been at and talk so much about. And I'd seen photographs that he had taken when he was there.
What are some of the things that he would talk about? Or teach you? Or?
Well, one that I think got me going, and we're sort of moving into different areas there between San Antonio and the training, and then in 1965 to be out in Vietnam. But he was very active in the humanitarian side and civilian support. So in the town that I was in was known as Nha Trang, which was a famous seaside city or town. And the Provincial Hospital was the civilian hospital in Nha Trang. And he had run different clinics there. He would have, let's say, a Thursday afternoon clinic. And that got me going, knowing that, and as a matter of fact, that's why I asked to be assigned to Vietnam. I had a choice. I was in a situation where at least I had a choice of where I was assigned to. It was either going to be Korea or Vietnam. So I chose Vietnam, particularly because he spoke so much of the other opportunities than just the military side, that you could do other things while assigned to that hospital.
Like you could help the civilians?
Yes. So we were very active. I got very active with the Provincial Hospital, got to know the staff, and they got to know me, and I kept pretty regular at it in spite of being busy at the 8th Field Hospital. So
how far apart were they?
A few miles.
Oh, okay.
I used to pack a surgical. I borrowed a surgical kit from our hospital, strapped it onto the back of my bicycle. I didn't have my own personal Jeep, like you sometimes see in the movies, that, you know, this hotshot doc is running all over the place in a Jeep or a tank or something like that. I just had my bike.
Right.
And he also was involved with, and I became involved with a leprosarium, where patients who had leprosy were really isolated in this community. That was run by one of the Catholic religious orders, but I don't recall what I keep thinking of St. Francis, but I'm not sure that was the name.
And all of this was in Nha Trang?
I'm sorry.
All of these are in Nha Trang?
Well, the leprosarium was well into the outskirts of the city. It was not in the city itself. And that would be somewhat typical of leprosariums at the time because
that makes
of
sense.
the concern about leprosy. So I would make trips out there with an interpreter that I had assigned and was available to me if I needed one.
Did you have concerns about leprosy?
No.
Why?
Well, when you look at the history of leprosy, it is not, if your personal hygiene is really good and you take good care of that factor and you're very careful about that, it's not contagious like you would think. In other words, if you had somebody with a deformity of the hand and you were examining, I wasn't worried about that.
It's not like poison ivy?
Right. That's right. It's a good point. So what happened was that they would occasionally send someone into the provincial hospital if we felt that there was, let's say, some particular problem with the hand, which happened to be a common problem. They could come into the provincial hospital, be treated, and then go back out to the leprosarium. And they had a pretty nice campus out there, and the brothers that, the religious order that ran it were very devoted, very friendly, and I happened to be able to get along pretty well. My wife is French, and I could manage a little bit with the French language, so that helped me in Vietnam.
Oh, okay.
Both at the provincial hospital and at the leprosarium. And the third place that was also a very good area of outside, and everyone wonders, how did I do all this in 24 hours a day? But somehow I managed to get around. And the other place was the military hospital. And they had a big army hospital. I don't know how I call it big, but it was a good-sized facility. And I got very friendly with two of the doctors at the military hospital. Had excellent, I would call it excellent rapport with them. And I would go over to their hospital and make rounds and see some of the patients there. And when I made rounds and visited at the provincial hospital, they would come over. So we were like three little buddies getting around and had good rapport, and I felt a friendly relationship. And I think once, reminding me now, I think once they asked me to help them in the operating room at their hospital. So I did get into the OR and get into the operating room there. So the inspiration from this one senior resident that I had during the training program got me all excited. So when they said, do you want to go to Korea, you want to go to Vietnam,
Right.
knowing a little French and knowing about the background of that being a former French colony, I felt very comfortable going there.
So your 8th Field Hospital assignment, what were the hours?
I'm sorry, what?
What was your schedule at the 8th Field Hospital?
When it's interesting that you asked that, because when I got there, when I arrived in March of 1965, very little was happening. And I always recall that there was one radiology, the expert in X-ray, and he rolled up his straw mat and he was off to the beach. And here I'm arriving and I'm looking around, and the 8th Field Hospital was a fixed installation with actual buildings, with ramps going between each of the buildings, and an X-ray department, a dental department, a laboratory. It was a well-equipped facility. It was not under 10.
It was the only one at the time
Yes,
in Vietnam.
that's right. So I would guess right now that sometime within three or 4 weeks of arriving to find someone wandering off to the beach, which wasn't far away, we suddenly had the massive buildup that took place in the spring of 1965. And I would say within maybe a very short time, almost the 400 beds that were available at the hospital were filled.
Oh my goodness.
So it was
No more going to the beach.
no more going to the beach. And so the hospital, and those were mainly you have to excuse my lack of recollection of names and numbers of the actual units, but they were mainly Marines that had landed in Da Nang.
The first air cav?
No, this would have been a Marine, mainly Marines that were up in the Da Nang area. They landed there, but had very limited medical resources. So for a large part, they were evacuated by air down to our hospital in Nha Trang. We also had other patients of special forces and other Army units, but the vast majority at that time were Marines.
How far was Da Nang? How long a flight would that have been for them?
You got me there. I guess maybe an hour, maybe less. Some expert would have to help me with recall for that.
And what was your opinion of their medics? What kind of shape were they in by the time they got to you? Do you think the medics did all they could?
Yes, I would say that, well, they also had, and that was kind of an interesting point too, they had, after, I don't know how many days or weeks, they had Navy physicians who were providing medical support at a certain time interval. And those Navy physicians would periodically come down to the 8th Field Hospital, and we ended up providing some medical equipment for them to take back up to Da Nang.
Because you were well supplied?
Yes, the 8th Field Hospital had an excellent supply center, and at least we were able to provide that for them. And so we got to know each other and went to the mess hall together and exchanged ideas and thoughts about the whole process that was going on at the time.
So when you said the 400 beds were filled, was that with the Marines?
Yes. A large percentage were, although we might have had other patients from the Special Forces, it's called the 5th Special Forces Group, were assigned on the other side of the air base where we were. So.
And that was your security? That was your security for, what was the name of the base at Nha Trang? What was the name of your base at Nha Trang?
I don't know that I don't recall whether the hospital, whether the airfield had a name that.
It was just
it probably did. Maybe it was in Vietnamese. I don't remember. But
the 5th
the 5th Special Forces Group were assigned to the other side, and those were the Green Berets.
Right.
So we got to know their physician, who was a very well-known and popular doctor at the time.
That's good.
But you asked about the time and the schedule. I think you asked me about that. And in spite of the busy schedule of operating and running a clinic and all that, I was able to get and make time, let's say on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I always had that clinic set up in the Provincial Hospital. So if I went into if everything was nice and quiet and nothing was happening that they needed me right away at the 8th Field, I'd hop on my bike or I'd bum a ride to get down to the Provincial Hospital, and they knew I was coming, so they would have patients there at the time that I could see and give advice. And occasionally I would be doing surgery there at the Provincial Hospital. And
how long would your longest surgery take?
The longest surgery? Well, it depends on the nature of the accident and the injury that happened to the patient. Some would be a good several hours. We had, I don't want to get into too much would be categorized as gory detail, but we had an incident that I was called one night by a doctor that I knew in the Army Medical Corps, and he called me from the airfield at Nha Trang, and he told me that we had a most serious case coming in. And I don't know how much, you want on
Go ahead.
an interview, but
It's fine.
this particular person got off the airplane and got an encounter with a propeller that was still running on that transport. So
awful.
we ended up with this doctor that I knew who happened to be on that flight, and we ended up in our operating room, and I would guess we were going till the wee hours of the morning. So that was probably one of the longest cases. Most of the other trauma injuries would have been set maybe at the most several hours, depending on the extent of the injury.
Well, I'm picturing you at one of the other locations where you would bicycle to.
Yes.
And what if the 8th Field Hospital needed you? We didn't have cell phones then.
That's right, there were no cell phones.
How would they get you? Or if you're in a long surgery, you can't leave. There's no one to replace you, right?
I never had a situation, luckily, where that happened.
Oh, it's
They
interesting.
always knew where I was.
Oh,
And
right.
if they had to send someone down in a Jeep or an ambulance to get me, they
Oh.
could have done it.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, but they
That
knew
makes
where I
sense.
was. And obviously, we had one other really difficult situation. I don't know if you want to hear a little bit
I do,
about it,
please.
but we had a medical conference in a room similar to this, and I can still almost recall it to this day, of where we stepped out of this little hut with a grass roof and fiberboard walls and everything, and there's an airplane flying around in the sky, and it didn't look like it's flying the way it's supposed to fly.
Oh.
And the next thing we knew, it crashed, and both pilots parachuted out of the plane. It landed. It was I believe it was called a Canberra bomber, Canberra. It landed in downtown Nha Trang.
Wow.
And of course, you raised a good point before. Communication between a civilian community and a civilian hospital and the telephone arrangements were not like today.
I've heard that, yeah.
And we were asked, I don't know how that got to us, we were asked to send some medical support to the downtown, Main Street actually, of Nha Trang, which we did. And of course everything is blocked off all over, and there was not much we could do.
Where did it hit exactly? Houses?
It hit somewhere right off the main street.
I mean, like buildings, houses, what exactly?
Yeah, there was a movie theater, but the number, I can't recall the number of casualties, and I don't think it was very high at all.
Oh, okay.
The problem was that this was a bomber. So all the streets were blocked off by whatever military personnel were available to do that. It was not that was not my area of involvement. They were blocked off because they were waiting for demolition crews to come up from, I'm just guessing, let's say somewhere near between Saigon and where we were. So no one was allowed to go onto the streets until all these bombs were taken care of.
I can't believe the bombs didn't go off when it crashed.
I can't explain that, and
Wow.
I never knew. But it's interesting, my wife heard about this accident she was in Paris at the time with our...
2 sons.
Yeah, we had the 3 by then. So she had the 3 children in Paris. And they had heard about this crash over there. So, of course, she's trying to find out how I'm doing, and I don't know how she found out that we were okay. But it was in one of the newspapers. So there was always something. There was never a time where nothing was happening, either in the civilian community to be helping there, or an incident like the bomber landing in downtown Nha Trang.
How did that turn out? You just stood by?
It turned out, I guess it turned out okay. We had several patients who ended up being admitted to our field hospital, and luckily we were able to do that. And
Did the pilot make it?
both of the pilots parachuted out and landed in the South China Sea, so they were okay.
Oh, that's
That was
amazing.
okay. Yeah. Well, they had a few injuries, but they worked out to be good. They worked out to be okay. One of the patients was a civilian patient who was brought to the 8th Field Hospital, and again, I can still almost picture the situation. Everyone thought he was sort of a little hysterical, complaining about whatever his pain was. And then one of our general surgeons, orthopedic like myself, examined this person and found out that he had an injury that required abdominal surgery. And it worked out fine, but everyone was sort of thinking, this fellow, and you couldn't communicate too well, even with interpreters.
Because of dialects?
Because of his Vietnamese, he was a Vietnamese citizen.
Right.
And it worked out well that he was taken care of, the general surgeons operated on, and they solved the problem. And he had been injured during the blast when that plane landed. Somehow he sustained whatever injury he has. I don't
Internal
remember the exact
bleeding?
diagnosis. I can recall one other thing if you have the time. Recall keeps coming back.
Good.
But I also had an interest in learning about the community, and I could walk up and down the main street. This is either well before the crash or after the crash, and I knew some Vietnamese words. I had prepared for that when I was at Fort Belvoir, and I had little cheat sheets made up that I carried around with me, and it would have in Vietnamese, how are you feeling? Are you having any pain?
Oh.
You know, where is your pain? And I could say some of those words in Vietnamese, not very well. And if they still didn't understand me, I would point to the sentence.
Oh, okay.
And say, how are you feeling?
That's a good
where's your
idea.
pain? So
Yeah.
I had little cheat sheets available for that, and I could walk up and down to the bookstore, and they would know me, and I could go in slacks and a shirt, and I didn't have to be in uniform, and or go by the shoemaker, and they would have little kids, and I had photographs of my 3 little ones, and I would take them out, and I would show the little kids. I would say, these are my, however you,
Right.
I don't recall
Kids.
the Vietnamese anymore, but I would say, these are my children. And they would laugh, and they were very friendly. And I had that, I guess, good luck and good fortune to be able to do that. Some of the war zones you hear about now, you wouldn't think that
Yeah, you don't know
would
who's
be-
the enemy and who's friendly.
that's right. And in a way, I didn't always know who these people were, other than the job they were doing in the pharmacy. I would go in and I'd buy some of the Chinese or Vietnamese pharmacy things.
What do you mean?
Well, they would have, like, there was a fracture, something that you could smear onto a fracture, and it was
Oh.
supposed to make it better.
Did you try it? Did it work?
I would say I didn't personally try it, but I did have a patient who came into one of the Provincial Hospital clinics with the wrist all smeared up with this fracture medicine. You know, it'd be like the roots, chopped up roots of plants or something.
Herbal, yeah.
Herbal. So,
So obviously it didn't work because they had to go to the hospital too, right?
I'm sorry.
The one with the wrist, the herbal remedy didn't work, so...
No, because this was 3 or 4 months later, so the fracture had healed in a not too good position.
Oh, and the scar tissue built
Right,
up.
around the bone. So the environment in the community was something that, as I watch a lot of what's going on now in Iraq and Afghanistan or wherever, I had that capability of being able to go, you know, dressed like I am now and walk or ride my bike down into the center of the town, and so I could buy a book if I wanted to, and feel comfortable doing that. And a lot of the things that I got a hold of when I was there, I was able to bring back with me. Books, a sample of the fracture medicine, things like that. And ultimately I did send, I think, the vast majority of all that to the Vietnam Center in Texas. So they have all of my memorabilia, majority of my memorabilia that I picked up on my casual wandering around, whether it was in Nha Trang or Saigon or whatever.
Did you give them the original photos that you had?
The original photographs are on 35 millimeter slides.
Oh, okay.
And I have all of those. They were all sent down there in conjunction with the Oral History Project at the Vietnam Center. And they copied everything. And they asked me at some point in time, if I don't want them anymore or I can't handle them anymore, they would like to have all the originals.
Yeah, the Library of Congress would probably like to have them too. It's up to you.
The difficulty today is you tell me, for example, where can you find a 35 millimeter projector?
I believe...
You have to go to one of these places now and get them all transposed over to a DVD.
I've filmed slides being shown on a projector here, usually from Vietnam veterans, but then we had the hurricane, so I can't say for sure if we still have the equipment for that.
So
We might, though.
that's
Sometimes they bring
their
their own projector, the veteran.
Yeah, I was photographing just about everything I could, and it adds up to well over 1,000 35 millimeter slides.
Oh my goodness.
And in that era and time frame, I had to take the rolls of film, package them in the little Kodak envelopes, put them in the mailbox at the hospital, ship it to San Francisco or wherever it meant, and then they would be shipped back, and I would have the slides. So I was able to do that and had a pretty good perspective on things that were going on at the time. I have a whole collection of flowers. I have a whole collection of
Flowers? Dried flowers?
no, flowers growing on the walls of a
Oh, okay, I'm
home.
sorry.
Yeah, and I had a number of medical photographs And I got to publish a couple of the articles that I was able to write in one of the publications over there.
A medical journal?
Yeah, they had one, a medical, well, it's a pretty basic medical journal for the Army at the time.
I wanted to talk about what you saw compared to what you learned way back in medical school, like joint replacements were getting a lot of attention, and straightening joints, stabilization of the spine with metal rods, the brace and limb specialists, prosthetics, orthists. That's a hard word to say.
And so you're asking, say
the span of time, things change with orthopedics, things improve. I want you to talk about what you saw that were improvements in the medical field for you personally.
Well, one improvement that may not relate so much to equipment and devices and things like that was that, and it's improved even better now in over the last few years with Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is that many of the patients were transported quickly by helicopter to our hospital. So I think one of the things that impresses me the most now that I'm thinking about it is that we were getting cases with injuries, patients with injuries, within hours of the time of the injury. Well, that makes a big difference in the care. At a hospital like in San Antonio at Brook General Hospital, those might be somebody with an automobile accident, or they may have been transferred from another hospital a week or two after the original injury. These were patients coming in who were almost immediately put on helicopters and transported to us. So many of those cases that we talked about before from Da Nang were patients who were stabilized. Someone put a splint on the wrist or on the leg, and then they would be brought in for the rest of the care. So to me, that was a big plus in the care of patients. Now it's even quicker.
What about with the spine, to keep the spine, straight and not to let them move anything?
Well,
so they wouldn't get paralyzed?
We had several patients who were either paralyzed based on gunshot wounds or shrapnel wounds of the spinal cord, and others, which you still hear about today, and a lot of the casualties occur from non-war injury, like automobile accident, or someone's on leave for a few days and gets into a fight and then gets injured. And we had at least one or two that were from, and this is, as I see the surfing that we see here at the beach in Seagirt or wherever, we had several injuries that were spinal cord injuries from
diving,
from surfing, and landing with one of the waves, whichever way you're not supposed to do, and they would end up with a spinal injury. So to me, the proximity of the hospital and in relationship to where patients were evacuated to made a big difference. What also happened in Vietnam was that doctor I mentioned before that brought the patient in who had been injured at the airfield,
the propeller accident?
He was the commander of a hospital unit in Saigon that came in a month or two after I arrived in March of 1965. He had command of what was called the 3rd Field Hospital. And by the time I left a year later, there were hospitals scattered all over South Vietnam with with orthopedic specialists, with the whole hospital system working for them.
Right. So the first month you were there, the 8th Field General Hospital was the only hospital in Vietnam, but after that,
was
there were
really
more.
the only key place to send somebody. But that changed, I would say, relatively quickly.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good for you that it changed. I wanted to talk about treating patients in mass casualty situations and medical evacuation. Metal plates, a small piece of metal with holes in it that screws are put through to hold a fracture in place. The Eggers plate.
Eggers plate.
Did you meet Dr. Eggers?
How did you happen to think of an Eggers plate?
You might have said it in your last interview.
Is that right?
Yeah, I was reading those 100 pages.
Because in Vietnam, at the time that I was doing the majority of the surgery, I really did not get into a lot of the use of some of those plates and screws, because for the war injury at the time, the philosophy was basically evaluate, stabilize, treat, sort of hold things together and get ready to transport, let's say, to the Philippines or to Okinawa or wherever we had additional hospitals. So I was not using a lot of the devices and appliances that you hear about today that are popular in holding the right. Those were not something that I would do, particularly because in the war wound, as I was trained then, maybe the training's a little different now, they were not what would be called clean wounds, so that if I fractured my wrist here...
Open fractures?
Right. They were open, most of them were open, and once you're in an open fracture in a war zone, it's not the cleanest environment. So I was not doing that. I was mainly...
That wasn't part of your surgery cases?
Setting the bone? That was part of my training to do that, but I was not doing what we would call the final reconstructive or surgery, use the word sometimes, definitive, or the final way. I would put individuals together, clean the wound, put a cast on, and they would be transported out the next day or the following day. We had very good Air Force support, because they could come in and out of the airfield in a Trang. There would be a short ambulance ride to take the patients out to the aircraft, and then they would be off to the Air Force Hospital in the Philippines. So I didn't...
Clark Air Force Base?
And you mentioned Eggers, only Dr. Eggers was one of the consultants for the orthopedic program at Fort Sam Houston at the Brooke General Hospital. Mm-hmm. He would come over from, I think, either Galveston.
Yes, I read that.
Yeah, so I was lucky to meet him, and he was
famous.
Dr. Eggers.
He was famous to you, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. We had very good consultants during that 3-year training program. So I didn't do that, but we had very excellent equipment, facilities, and supplies that I could stabilize somebody and get the arm or the shoulder or the knee or the foot, whatever it was, to get them ready for a trip out to the next level of care.
So I'm picturing an open fracture, let's say the femur, and do you put it back together and then cast it and then splint it? You kind of just put the bone back together.
It can grow back together. Is put together in a way, for example, we use a pin, like a pin that could be put in another part of the same limb, and that could be incorporated in the cast so that things weren't moving around in there. And
Sounds
then
good.
the transportation would be a very stable environment
Right.
for that individual.
And less
they were on
painful.
antibiotics and
Pain
fluids,
med.
pain medication. So that's how we would handle the majority of the patients that I had.
My other medical question was, you mentioned gunshot wounds to the spine. Would you remove the bullets? Sometimes bullets get left
There were
in.
occasions where there were occasions where it was easy to get to take the bullet out. Unfortunately, on one hand, we did not have neurosurgeons at the 8th Field Hospital. Matter of fact, I'm not sure whether there may have been one in Saigon. And most of those, I don't recall that we had that many, and of the few, I remember removing one or two fragments from the area of the spine, but not a lot. Fortunately, there were not a lot. The majority would have been extremities, that's the arms and legs. I also developed, and another example of that would be I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The injuries that you're asking about, we had a large number of amputations from landmines. And I kind of put together a lot of information and material about landmine injuries in Vietnam. And I think that may have been documented somewhat in the Vietnam Center with the slides that were submitted to them. And we had one of the representatives of the Surgeon General come through the 8th Field Hospital. And I was able to put on a little exhibit for him of the types of injuries that we were having with the landmines. So there again, it was a matter of either completing an amputation that already had happened from the mine blast itself, or stabilizing the foot or the hand so the person could be taken to the Philippines or back to the United States. And that particular landmine injury evaluations that I was doing, I was able to use that later on when I was commander of the 340th General Hospital and involved with the reserve hospitals. I was able to use that as a training tool, those slides, and then my 35mm projector was working, and I was able to use the 35mm projector.
You took pictures of your cases?
Yeah, I had slides of all of those, at least 10 or 15 of the cases that I had.
The landmine accidents?
Yeah, the original injury as it presented when it first came in, the x-rays of that extremity, and the picture before they left and medically evacuated back to the Philippines or to the United States. So that became a use of the knowledge that I had into the later life in the Reserve Medical Corps. And looking at the IED injuries that we see from Iraq and Afghanistan always makes me think of how we were handling them then, and the difficulties of handling that. And then you see from pictures of Walter Reed and the rehab center there's a huge Wounded Warrior program down in San Antonio at the medical center. But we were doing what we could at the time. You know, it wasn't sophisticated, but it was the appropriate medical care, we thought. The same thing was happening to the Vietnamese. I mean, I would see patients with some of the similar problems in the Provincial Hospital, except they didn't get the following care that
The second phase of the
that
care,
our troops would have.
the definitive care.
Right. I had one patient that I think is in that slide collection. There were Vietnamese troops that were working with the special forces. I think they used the name Montagnard.
Yes.
The Montagnard. And we had an amputee, a person with a lower extremity amputation. And he came in not so much as an active surgical patient, but he came in as to see if something could be done. So I got involved with taking and I don't know if this was in any prior interview that I might have been asked about it, but I got a piece of bamboo and I was able to make something that would fit to the upper part of his leg in conjunction with this piece of bamboo, so he had something to stand on and didn't have to use crutches completely.
Right.
And he had to still use a support or something. But I was able to fix something. We're talking about primitive and antique ways of doing things. But I think he was happy. He was always smiling and spoke a little French. And that worked out all right. I'm sure he needed much more than that. There was a prosthetic unit, not a unit, but a prosthetic facility in Saigon. And I don't know who was running it, how long it was running, but some of the civilian or the Vietnamese casualties were able to get care there.
How was morale for you, being away from your wife and 3 kids for a year?
Oh, that's another question. And again, no cell phones, no Skype.
No.
It was a little bit difficult. Letters, yes. I mean, the mail, luckily, was pretty good going in and out of there. But it's still a week or two time gap between when you write and when they get it, and vice versa. When I was on R&R for one of the trips to, I was able to get to Hong Kong, I was able to make a long-distance call and get through to her, and we chatted a little bit there.
Oh, she couldn't join you?
No, there were no family members in, like you hear about in Korea now. We have troops there where there's a family there, but there were none in Vietnam.
I meant, like, I've heard about a Vietnam guy going to Hawaii for R&R and his wife joined him.
Oh, maybe, yeah, that may be. I don't know whether Hawaii was on the R&R list at the time.
Oh, okay.
But Bangkok and Hong Kong, I don't know.
So how was Hong Kong?
I liked Hong Kong.
Yeah. It was ruled by the British at the time, right?
Yes, it was a British colony. Again, I think luck seemed to prevail with a lot of my doing things. In Nha Trang, there was a group of civilian doctors who helped us at the Provincial Hospital. That was their duty, and their job was to help treat the civilians in a community, wherever they are. And one of those doctors knew a doctor who was going to be in Hong Kong. So when I got to Hong Kong, at one of the British hospitals, Queen, don't ask me which queen it was named after, but this was a well-known orthopedic surgeon who was visiting there from Scotland. So I made a couple of calls and they said, yes, come on over. So I spent the rest of the day, or maybe 1 or 2 days, with this orthopedist who was way above my level of academia and the world of academic medicine. And he took me on rounds. We went to visit one of the well-known rehab hospital, workers' compensation rehab hospitals in Hong Kong. Took me to one of the children's hospitals and rehab centers in Hong Kong. So once again, I was running around and doing things that made that whole year experience far more than just going back and forth to the one hospital and only being involved with one activity.
Sounds like you made the most of it.
I would say so, and also had a couple of good dinners in Hong Kong at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So,
What was good to eat in Hong Kong?
well, I got out of there with no problems.
There was no
gastrointestinal problems. So to me, it was good.
there was no sushi then, was there?
There was no what?
Sushi, raw fish?
No.
No.
I wouldn't have been involved with that. Anything I had, I wanted well cooked.
Well cooked, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
So it sounds like every time you were off, you actually preferred to work.
Or do something that, involved professional life
Did that continue
and
in your
cultural life.
Did that continue in your civilian life? When you're off, you're working, or when you're retired, you're working?
Well, it was up until a few years ago when I sort of stopped a lot of the activities that I've been involved with. One example, which came up a little bit in discussion with
Kaylee?
your intern,
Yeah.
and that was in Hartford. I got involved with the Hartford Medical Society and the museum, and that was a wonderful opportunity to continue doing things. We put on an exhibit that the governor came to and others came to for military medicine. So the museum already had artifacts like we have here at this museum, and we put it together in a very, very nice catalog that I got into a little trouble with at the time. The company that I worked for was able to give us a grant to pay for putting this publication together. And it was a very nicely done one, but whoever did the final printing of the cover used a kind of a gold color for the title page, the cover page. And the word sort of got around as like, who approved using that expensive technique for the cover of this particular museum brochure? But it worked out okay, and we were able to do a lot with that, and I had some of the artifacts that I had collected and hadn't sent down to the Vietnam Center.
How'd you hear
So
about
I've continued a lot of things over time that have been interesting and doesn't get boring.
So while you're in Connecticut, how did you hear about the Texas Vietnam Center in Lubbock, Texas? Do you remember? Or how did they hear about you?
I'm not sure of exactly what hit me, occurred to me at the time, but there was something about oral history or the Vietnam Center. And so I was in contact with them, and then Steve Maxner, who's now, I think he's the director there now. And he was involved with the oral history program. And they contacted me, or I contacted them, and that set up the whole thing. I don't remember exactly who called who.
Okay. Well, we should say that that interview was extremely helpful to me today, and that's why I had so much information.
Okay.
I looked online at the 100-page transcript. I didn't get through all of it, but it's from your 7-hour interview you did with him.
The one thing that they sent me a copy, and this isn't telling anything that I shouldn't say, but one of the things with the oral interview was that, and it may be happening in the same thing now, is that when you look at a transcript, the printed copy of a interview like that, and I started looking at, well, geez, I wouldn't have used that, or I was saying, you know too much, or I was using words or whatever that didn't sound like it would be part of a final document, edited. But they didn't want to do that.
They wanted you to do it. You had to edit.
They didn't want, unless there was something.
I thought you did edit. Go ahead.
The thing that they would let me do was if something was not correct or the spelling wasn't right. But if I said or I said the, which I probably do now, they wouldn't let me. I wanted to delete all that junk stuff between sentences.
They were very particular.
They wanted the interview as it was. So.
I had a question going back to Fort Bragg.
Is that?
We're back on, yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Airborne parachute exercises generated orthopedic cases, plus there were motor vehicle accidents there with the 82nd Airborne?
Yes. That was at Fort Bragg.
Do you want to speak on anything with that? What happened when they parachuted and then they got hurt?
Well, at Fort Bragg, being the airborne center that it was, that was one of the situations that we were on call for at the hospital if there was an accident involving one of the training jumps that took place there. However, at Fort Bragg, my job there, I was not there as an orthopedist. I was there for what would be called general surgery. So they didn't let me. I was not directly involved with the day-to-day care at Fort Bragg. There were other doctors who were purely the orthopedists there, but I got to see what was going on, or if there was a combined injury with something else, kidney or abdomen or whatever, then that would be where we would possibly take place. But as a first-year resident, that's the lowest guy on the totem pole in the hierarchy of running a hospital. So I wasn't doing day-to-day care, but I knew that these things were happening. These events were taking place.
Like if a Green Beret landed in a tree or something?
Right.
Like what would cause the injury?
But at the time, from the training that I was supposed to be doing, I was not on call directly for orthopedics at that hospital. That was only the doctors that were there to handle the orthopedic cases. We might have been called in if there was a problem with the field for kidneys or urology, which is what that specialty would take care of. But no, I wasn't involved directly with
What about OBGYN?
And then I had I had 4 months of obstetrics there. Again, the requirements for training at that time was that I was supposed to do everything but orthopedics. But I always kept one eye out for what was going on with orthopedics, because that was what I wanted to do. But we had a very busy obstetrics and gynecology clinic there.
Did you deliver babies?
I was involved with deliveries, yeah.
Well, that's exciting. Were there any multiple births?
I don't recall.
You don't remember?
I don't recall.
What year were you in North Carolina at Fort Bragg? 59?
I was at Fort Bragg. It would have been 1958 to 1959.
I thought 58 was Fort Sam Houston.
Well,
No?
there's a period of like 4 to 6 weeks where I was there for the basic
Okay.
school, medical field service school it was called then.
How was it leaving Vietnam? How was it for you?
Pretty good, I would have to say.
As the plane took off, did everyone cheer?
Where, say that again, I'm sorry.
As the plane took off and got up in the sky, did everyone cheer on the plane, leaving Vietnam?
When I left? Well, that's a whole different story.
Okay.
When I was ready to leave Vietnam, I had a date, and the orders all written out, and there was an explosion of one of the fuel tanks on the airbase, and one of the people, I don't know exactly what his rank or anything about it, was severely burned. And from the time of the explosion, we weren't very far from that. And he was brought into the hospital. The general surgeons who were assigned to the 8th Field Hospital got him prepared for evacuation, and it was decided by somebody above my pay grade at the time to have a doctor on board the plane with that patient to go back. So lo and behold, I was assigned the duty to go back on that Air Force medical evacuation plane. I can't give you the designation of the exact aircraft. So I went back on that airplane ahead of the time, maybe a day or two ahead of my original orders.
Oh, okay.
So that's how I got back
To the U.S.
to the U.S. And we landed directly in San Antonio. It went from Hawaii, whatever the stops were, Hawaii, and then to San Antonio. So in a way, it was a little bit of a homecoming for me to go back that quickly to where I had trained. So I got to look around and meet people that I knew there and so forth. But the experience of going back on one of those medevac planes was outstanding. You know, the plane, instead of having seats for business class, first class, and economy, these were all stretchers or litters, all stacked up.
Right.
And I had a little seat somewhere, I don't remember now. But that's how I got back. So there was there was a farewell party. There was a goodbye party for me before I left. Excuse me.
At the 8th Field?
At the 8th Field Hospital,
Okay.
yeah. That there was that. But when I took off, I guess we went out in a hurry, so there was no one waving goodbye at the time. But we had very good rapport. You asked about, how life would be for us there. We had a very, call it close-knit, I mean, very good morale amongst those of us working in the hospital. And I don't think it could have been any better than that, to have that atmosphere. As far as we were talking a little earlier about my wife and three children, they had an apartment very near a well-known tourist center attraction in the middle of Paris. So the three little ones were all enrolled in school in France at the time.
So that's where home was for you?
For my wife and kids while I was in Vietnam.
Because she had family there?
Yeah, there was other family, her brother and his kids and all. So it worked out kind of well because they became pretty much bilingual. And when I had my first leave after finishing the tour in Vietnam, I went to Paris. I wanted to try to go from Saigon or Nha Trang directly there, but there was no way to get routed on a commercial airline that way, and I didn't have any government right to use any of the embassy planes or whatever was flying over Thailand and over that territory. So when I visited the children and the family there, the children were really basically bilingual and had almost forgotten in that year some of the English that they knew. You know, we were living in Virginia, Fort Belvoir, so they all had semi-southern accents from living in the South, so to speak.
Right.
And here they had their French, and they were pretty good at it. And they were good at, I still kid them about it. I said, you guys knew more profanity in French than I ever knew, because they're growing up with other kids there in school, and every curse word that you could possibly come up with, they knew in French.
And your wife could translate?
Oh yeah, sure.
She would tell you what they were saying?
Well, no, I knew some. I mean, it wasn't very complicated with the kids.
How old were the kids? About? Grammar school?
The youngest would have been somewhere about 1961 would have been, about 4, 6, and 8 maybe.
So where did the Army want you after your leave was over? Where were you supposed to be? What was your job?
That's when I was assigned to Fort Belvoir.
And that was your last year, right? You got out in '67.
After Fort Belvoir, I had the Vietnam tour. When I came back from Vietnam, the sequence, get it straight here, after I came back from Vietnam would have been West Point at the military academy.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So, did your wife keep the house in Fort Belvoir?
No, we were not. That was not authorized. She had to get out.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
There. She had to leave on the ship a month before I left. So guess who was involved with having to clear up the house, make sure the stove was all clean and spit and polish and everything like that.
Oh, your last month was alone here before you went overseas.
Right.
All right, so U.S. Army Hospital, West Point.
Was the last military active duty assignment.
Active duty, right.
Yeah.
Do you want to share any memories from that location? It's a beautiful area, right?
Well, that was a whole different experience to be able to be at the military academy. I mean, to me, that was really an ideal assignment.
Why?
Just the facility there's a brand new, not a brand new one, but there's a new hospital that was developed there after I left. So I was at one of the old, in the old building, the old hospital. And just the lifestyle, the experience of meeting the young men. There were no women cadets at the time.
Right.
Meeting some of the faculty members. It was just, you know, if I had an opportunity to stay there for a long tour, I would have been very happy to do that. But there were other forces prevailing in that. I think, if you remember in the beginning, I mentioned that when you sign up for one of these residencies like I did then, you have an obligation of a year payback for every year that they give for training. And as the time worked out, my wife never forgot that I had been committed to a year payback for every year.
Mm-hmm.
So when the time came for the 4th year, she said, well, basically said, well, you said we were going to get out of the service after we paid back the time. And that was what was going on at West Point. So things were a little bit difficult because here I was in actually a terrific assignment, and the idea was, well, we really should be getting out and become civilians again. So what happened was that I had applied for discharge, but I was held on what's kind of like a freeze, where you can't get out because of the Vietnam War.
Oh, okay.
So I was held over way beyond my, what would have been
Obligation.
The official payback date.
How far beyond? Months?
Maybe, yeah, several months time span there. Excuse me. So, but the housing was excellent.
Yeah.
The academic environment of being in a university like that, the parades, the sports, all of that was just a wonderful atmosphere.
The Army-Navy games, football games?
Well, the Army-Navy game was never held there, so it was, I think
I didn't
at
know
that
that.
time it was always in, I think, Philadelphia or somewhere.
Oh, that's interesting.
But the children were able to go to school. My children were able to go to school there, and you know, on the Hudson, looking out over the Palisade type geography there. It was just a great place to be.
So your wife wanted to move and you didn't?
And to become, well,
Where did she want to
Yeah.
move?
well, we moved eventually to West Hartford, Connecticut, and that's when I went into the civilian world.
Where was your family?
In New York City,
Oh, that's right.
yeah, there wasn't too much of a family left, a very small family there. But eventually I was able to stay active in things, and eventually got back into the reserve. I could use a lot of the experience that I had with the reserve units that I was in. And I had...
When you got discharged, did you switch to reserves, or you entered the reserves
No,
much later?
I had a long break between 1967 and 1983.
So what happened in 1983 that prompted you to join the reserves?
That's a good one. I ran into a doctor who was working, we were working together at West Point, and he was in orthopedic practice in Hartford. And we were at a meeting, and he said, "Oh, I'm going back in the reserve." and I'm going to get assigned to West Point, which is where we both were. I said, how is that possible? What's going on? So I said, can you give me the name of the recruiter that Medical Corps had individuals who were specifically working on acquisition of physicians. I got the name of that recruiter. We became good friends later on. And I said, what would I need to do? So as you know from your experiences here, I got a stack of papers, application, and I started to fill them all out. And this friend of mine said, they're going to assign me to West Point and I'm going to get my rank back. Because he was also a lieutenant colonel. Both were at the time. I said, geez, that's really great. How can they secure that for you? And I found out that I would not be in at my original rank, that I would have to be the rank of major pending congressional approval of promotion to lieutenant colonel. I also found out later on that he never had a guarantee that he would go back to West Point.
That makes more sense, yeah.
And they were not going to guarantee him that he was going to have congressional approval to get his original rank back. Whereas I was willing to say, I'm going to go back, and if I don't get that, I'm still going back.
Oh.
In other words, I came back in as the rank of major, pending at some point the promotion would take place, hopefully.
There has to be a slot for you for that to happen, right?
I'm sorry?
There has to be a slot open for you to go move up?
I guess that's how part of that is done. So I was willing to, I decided I wanted to come back. I had long discussions with my wife, who, as we said before, was not that enthusiastic about my staying in for a military career. But now, with all the children grown up and away at school and no problem, she went right along with it. So
you were middle-aged by then, right? You were 51?
Yeah, somewhere around there. And it turned out he never came back, this particular person never came back in the reserve. He didn't, because they wouldn't guarantee him the assignment, and they wouldn't guarantee him the promotion, although it probably would have happened anyway for the promotion. And I got assigned to a hospital in New Haven, another general hospital, and had all sorts of good experiences after that.
You had your own practice in the civilian life?
No, I was one of the medical directors in the claim department at Aetna Life and Casualty. I got out of clinical practice completely and went into purely administrative.
How old were you then?
Well, let's see, let you do the math, but that would have been in 1967.
Oh, you were only 35. You were young.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
So you had seen enough surgeries and you wanted to move on?
Yeah, and I like the administrative side of medicine in hospital management, hospital administration. And in fact, in the Army, there's very often sort of, at least in those years, a way of programming someone over time to say, well, if you stay at West Point for 3 years or 4 years, then you would be eligible for a tour in, let's say, Germany at Landstuhl, the general hospital there.
Right.
and then you would come back, you could come back to the hospital administration, the master's program in hospital administration. It was administered through Baylor University, so it would have been back in San Antonio. So I sort of had, at that point, 9 years, almost 10 years, I had sort of a projection, if I had stayed in, what would have been possible. And I liked administration. I liked the organizational idea of seeing how a hospital works and being part of it.
So you're retired from Aetna?
Well, I retired from Aetna in 1994, and I retired from the Army in 1994. I retired from Aetna. 1995, retired. March of 95, retired from military service.
From the reserve, at rank of colonel.
Correct.
What was your job in '83 with the reserves? Where did you go?
Oh, well, when I came back in the reserve, I was assigned to the 340th General Hospital.
Oh, okay.
That was the...
New Haven.
Yeah, in New Haven. So that was a great experience because, again, using some of my knowledge from prior service, I think people appreciated, because that was kind of a lull. And there was not like being in a unit in the middle of the Iraq-Afghanistan war. So anyone talking about experiences and what to do in an emergency, like you said before, mass casualty situations, there was a lot of interest in that because there were not a lot of veterans who had the same experience that could talk about it. And I had a good opportunity to do that. Could give lectures and conferences, use my 35 millimeter slides. So that worked pretty well.
Was it hard with all the adrenaline rush of Vietnam surgery to come back here and do regular surgery without a war going on?
Well, when I left West Point in 1967 and I resigned and
Active duty.
Active duty, I went directly into Aetna as a physician in the claim department there. So I was no longer directly in clinical practice. And you raised an interesting thought, and that is that in 1967, and I imagine some of the other veterans that you've spoken to, the sentiments and all about Vietnam were really kind of mixed, and pro-Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War, and I ended up in a medical department of this company with at least two of the doctors that I worked with administratively doing the insurance work. One had been a medic in World War II, and one had been trained similar to my training in the Air Force. So there was kind of a homogeneous group at that particular time. But we were not there was no clinical practice, no more hands-on.
Right.
And a lot of the more senior people in the company, and I think I've written about this and we've spoken about it, there was very little feeling or communication about, hey, here's a guy from Vietnam, and what has he got to say and what's going on? Excuse me.
And that would help you deal with it better, cope better?
Well, I had enough, I was coping, I had a lot to cope with just learning the business and learning how to handle that new field of
Medical administration?
administrative and medical claim handling. But, you know, at lunchtime, some of the senior guys, we had a nice little dining area, and there would be the comment like, well, in WW2, this is what we did, and this is the way it was on the ship when we shipped out and shipped back and all that. And here I'm sitting there, well, I understand.
Right.
And no one was saying, like you asked before, did they wave goodbye when you left Vietnam as the plane took off? There was no, and so I got kind of.
You came back by yourself, but World War II they came back with their unit. It's a big difference.
I went there by myself to Vietnam. I was an individual going there.
Wow.
I was not I said before, a friend of mine had the 3rd Field Hospital. Well, he went in with a whole hospital unit. I was just myself going there as the new orthopedist coming on board.
Oh.
And so
that's unusual.
the field, what was beginning to happen in Connecticut, where I was, and in other places, the anti-war sentiment was obviously growing in 67, 68, and petitions were flying around against the war. Nixon was the president, I believe. And before I went to Vietnam, I had read a number of books about the history of the country, the culture, all that. And at Fort Belvoir, just to go back a minute, there were some visiting Vietnamese engineers at Fort Belvoir, one of whom came in as a patient one day, and he spoke a little French and whatever. We became friends, and we had him to dinner, and it became very nice. And you know, throw in here for a second, you know who met me at the airport, at the air base just outside of Saigon, was this Vietnamese engineer, Lieutenant Colonel, met me at the airport.
So
which I mean, to me, that was, again, just a fantastic situation.
No one else gets that. No one else gets to be met by a friend in Vietnam when they land.
And he was one that was helping me with my little cheat sheets on how to say certain things in Vietnamese to talk to patients.
Okay.
And I was going over audio tapes on the language with him, so I had a little bit of that at the time. But what was happening, and in the 67, 68, 69, it started to occur to me, and this is not always the greatest, depending on who you're talking to, it started to bother me about the war. And why are we there? What are we doing? What's going on? The bombings, so forth and so on. And so I, fully supported everything that I was involved with at the hospital.
Of course.
And the patient care and the humanitarian activity in the civilian community.
Right.
So I didn't have a lot of time to look at the geopolitical situation to, contemplate why is the 8th Field Hospital here? That wasn't the issue. But later on, trying to look at it objectively, it started to bother me as to what we were doing. and how was it being handled.
So what was the answer? Why was the field hospital there that you were in?
Oh, originally, the field hospital predated my arrival by at least, I'm just guessing, at least 3 or 4 years. And that was there to support, there was an element of the United States Army, I don't know whether it was Special Forces or what, that were there as an advisory group. And you probably have others who you've spoken to have much more knowledge of that. But that was one of the only hospitals that was available in that part of the country for our personnel. But what bothered me later on was as to the rationale for why we were there and what are we doing, and what role Ho Chi Minh, who was the kind of the key guy up in North Vietnam, what is their role? And so I sort of got a little bit into the idea of I wasn't out protesting on the street or anything.
Or at the White House?
I remember I wrote a letter to Nixon.
Oh.
But never mailed it.
You still have it?
You know, about, it might be buried somewhere in the stuff that I didn't send down to the Vietnam Center. But it started to bother me a little bit about exactly what we were doing and the loss of lives and injuries. I think we had, by the end of the war, when it was all over, I think there's been, over 55,000?
58,000.
58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall.
Have you been there?
Washington. I beg your pardon?
Did you visit that wall?
Oh, yeah.
What kind of experience was that for you?
Difficult. Difficult.
Did you know any of the people whose names are on the wall?
Well, they would, if their names had been recorded the way they're supposed to be, casualty reporting, yes, they would have, those names, when you're visiting the wall, unless you know where you're looking, it's kind of hard to find. And I didn't know that, wouldn't have remembered the specific name of somebody. I have some of the reports that I've collected, and those names may have been there, but I didn't know
personally
whose name I would be looking at. Someone would be standing there doing a tracing of somebody's name, or what I did do was, and it was traditional then, I left my jacket that I had used in the, it wasn't camouflage then, it was just a regular field jacket. I left that there along with, I forgot what else I left as a token of my thoughts about it. And other people, I guess, had flowers or whatever. Some have left medals there. And I left that there. And I found out later on that there's a warehouse, somebody in Washington, somewhere in Washington, that they collected a lot of these items, and they're all stored somewhere, which I didn't know at the time.
It might be the Smithsonian, I'm not sure.
Well, it may be a part of it, but it must be a warehouse out in Maryland or wherever. So yeah, there's a lot of emotion involved, and of course, the more we talk, the more it can get emotional than just straight away facts about an injury or whatever. But it was not an easy time, and maybe that's why I didn't rush to get back in a reserve unit when I left in 1967. I think it was time to get out.
Oh, okay.
And a time to leave some of that behind.
What about the race riots, 66? Did that affect you or anything like that?
And where was that?
The race riots, they were in a lot of places, LA, Newark, Asbury Park. I'm not sure where else, maybe Chicago or Detroit.
Plainfield, there are other
Maybe.
areas around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my next door neighbor was activated with a reserve unit,
Mhm.
artillery unit, during one of those riots
Newark, maybe.
in Newark.
That was
And
67,
Plainfield.
yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my next door neighbor and I chat about that. But no, I'd have to say that that may have been happening, but I had
Mm-hmm.
I had many other interests.
Okay. Is there anything that we didn't talk about? Did you get packages when you were overseas?
As a matter of fact, yeah, my dad was pretty good with that. At that time, I was a pipe smoker, and periodically he would ship one of the tobaccos that I was fond of at the time, and so I did get some packages. Yeah, and the mail was pretty good, as I said before. The in and out mailbox went pretty well at the time. Always flights coming in and out. We were right next to an airfield, so whatever the postal system was to get stuff from the hospital mailbox out to the field worked pretty well.
Oh, that's good.
Same coming back the other way.
I'm curious, how many years were you a pipe smoker?
Not very long.
Oh, okay.
Not long, but long enough to acquire some good pipes, which are now stored up in the attic in a neat little box. And picked up a few in Hong Kong when I was there.
Nice.
But no, I stopped the smoking probably in the early 70s. And haven't gone back to that at all.
That's good. When you were discharged in 67, did you use your GI Bill?
I used, I'm glad you reminded me about that. Only on a very limited basis. I had an opportunity to go to one of the executive programs at the Harvard Business School, and some of the books and some of the papers that I had to purchase there, or documents I had to handle there, I did put in for some coverage for that.
That was after you got out?
Excuse me.
That was after discharge?
Yes, but that's the only time that
What about a mortgage? The GI Bill for the mortgage?
yeah, there for veterans in West Hartford, where I did take the famous 214 form over there, and there was a small percentage off the real estate tax, same as here in New Jersey, which I did recently here as well.
There was also something with insurance. Did you take the insurance?
Yeah. Well, once I got out, I was no longer involved with insurance through the military. I'm not sure I know what
There
that
was
is.
some kind of offer, some kind of deal, maybe life insurance. I'm not sure. I haven't heard about it in a while.
One of the opportunities and benefits in retirement is the TRICARE for Life is available to retirees as a secondary payer.
Oh, that's good.
So that is something that we certainly use.
That was after you retired from the reserves, right?
Yes,
As a colonel.
yes,
So you get a pension for that
for retirement, yes.
from the colonel pension.
Right.
And also, did you join any veterans groups?
Well, there are two very big ones that I belong to. One was the Reserve Officers Association, and I had the honor of being known as the Connecticut Department Surgeon. I never had to operate. All I had to do was write reports about meetings. that I went to that involved some of the medical issues in the military.
Did that have something to do with Reserve Officers Association?
That's
Or
called the ROA, is the Reserve Officers Association, yes.
But the Connecticut Department Surgeon, is that a part of that?
That's
separate?
Each state had its own department. So the Connecticut department, and we have one here in New Jersey also that has a certain membership, like we had maybe 700 members in Connecticut. And so I would go to meetings and be involved with different programs that we put on. We used to do an annual meeting at Trinity College, which is a small private college in the Hartford area. And we would put on, we would have guest speakers on issues on China, on whatever subjects might have been interesting to. So I was involved and did some work with that, and eventually worked my way up to the kind of the president of that department, or the head of that department. And then we had another one known as the Military Officers Association of America, MOAA. And so in Connecticut, there were lots of ways that either retirees or veterans or whatever, if you had interest, there were things to do and provide information to people and groups.
How
Also,
long after you finished your time in the reserves did you join any of these groups?
Oh, right in the beginning.
Oh, okay.
All along, yeah.
That's great.
So I would work that in between everything else.
What about American Legion, where you live now?
I was a member of the American Legion in Connecticut, in West Hartford, but I was only I was a member, but I never got involved. But here, I have been involved with our Post 529 since its origin, and around about 8 years now. In Connecticut, there's a Connecticut State Veterans Hospital, very similar to one that I visited a couple of days ago up in Menlo Park.
Oh.
There's
Why were you
the
there?
New Jersey Veterans Memorial Home in Menlo.
Why were you
Are
there?
you familiar with that?
I am. I filmed there. Once I went up and filmed there years ago.
Okay, so Post 529 has been, the last year or two, we gave a donation to the Veterans Home, and some of the women at Four Seasons at Wall knitted some beautiful lap blankets. So we brought all of those up the other day and met with the director of the facility, and one of our residents at Four Seasons knew one of the full-time permanent residents at Menlo Park, so she came along and we were up there. But I was on the board at the hospital in Connecticut. It's at Rocky Hill, Connecticut, old-time institution. You look at some of those photographs before the turn of the century, and now it's an updated hospital and facility there for state veterans who qualify for that hospital. And while I was on the board there, they opened a program, type of a hospice program for more terminally ill patients. They opened an Alzheimer's unit. And one of the big things for veterans, which I haven't seen recently noted here in New Jersey, but it's probably going on, maybe it's going on. And we did what's called a stand down.
Yes, I've heard of that.
Okay, that's where on a weekend, let's say a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, almost the entire campus of the hospital would be open for bringing in veterans from all over the state who wanted to go. And there were some very active young people who knew where to look under some of the bridges, in some of the alleyways, where some of the homeless veterans, the stand down provided some legal advice, some counseling about maybe possibly trying to get a job, provide clothing, food, haircuts. So that stand down was a big thing that I got involved with through the Reserve Officers Association, and I was a little bit involved with the helping to coordinate the medical side of that.
They were examined too? They had medical
exams? Yeah, you could.
Physicals?
They had a clinic area where the veterans would come in and have their ears tested and
Get flu
blood
shots?
pressure. Maybe some would get flu shots. I don't recall that about the immunizations. So there's always been something going on which has been interesting, but in the last few years I've kind of not done a whole lot. I visited here before Storm Sandy and brought my family and some visitors we had from Europe over here to visit the museum. But now you've gotten a resurgence of all this, all the juices in terms of military life back.
That's great.
And seeing what's going on over here now with the $30+ million building going up for training, and the facilities here I think are fantastic. And what's happened to the museum since the storm.
A lot of work went into it, and a lot of people helped us
Oh yeah,
from across the country.
yeah.
People who were affected by Katrina came and helped us. I had a question about Vietnam. Were you involved with the mass casualty from Nha Trang Valley? 76
No.
soldiers? Okay.
No.
I thought that was around the same time period, the same year you were there.
I'd have to look at the dates to be sure.
Oh, okay. You don't remember mass casualties other than when
Well,
you first...
we had a number of mass casualty situations where 30 or 40 patients would be brought in at the same time off one of the flights, like I mentioned earlier, from Da Nang or from any of the other areas. But to know the name of a specific event or battle may have come in the time of history over time, that somebody labels that particular situation as a named battle or a named episode. For us at the hospital at that time, we just knew there were 40. There were 40. We would sit there in the big waiting area of the emergency room, waiting for the plane to land, and I wouldn't have known, or I don't recall knowing the name of the specific location geographically, which area
where
they came from. But that may be that there's a good film, but I haven't seen it.
Who would do the triage? A nurse or a doctor?
Oh no. We. I was saying we're sitting around in a room like this room here, and waiting for the patients to arrive. But those physicians, like myself, were involved with the triaging, and that means deciding what level of care the person needs right away versus somebody who could be delayed for later. A small wound on a shoulder that not very complex would be delayed, whereas somebody who
Can't
has
breathe.
one of the major amputations or major injury like that would be almost instantly brought to the operating
Right.
room.
If they're spurting blood.
What's that?
If they're spurting blood from an artery.
Well, that's putting it very, very graphically, but
Sorry.
no, they shouldn't. At the time that they're landing in the emergency area for triage, hopefully certain things are under control, and the bleeding would be under control and things like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they would have pressure dressings applied by the medics in the field and all that. So
That's good. Did you ever see anybody again from then, from Vietnam, or from your basic training, from your Texas days? Or
I've seen other Vietnam veterans, and I've met other Vietnam veterans. There are a few even in our post 529. But from the hospital itself, for a while, like so many things, you write a few letters and you try to keep a few contacts going. But of all of that time, I followed up with a couple of the nurses who I knew because I saw one of them had an article published later on.
Oh, that's
I
interesting.
wrote an article about one of the things that's done in the medical field is there are teams of people who, like there'd be a team of doctors to take care of orthopedic cases, small team, a couple of surgeons and a couple of other trained enlisted personnel, and they would come in with a packaged unit to assist us at the 8th Field Hospital. So they would have, come in with gear, this packages the size of this conference table or something like that, and so they would support our need at the time. And I did follow up with the surgeon who headed that unit when he came into Nha Trang where I was. We followed up together for a while. We wrote a paper together on one of the subjects we were interested in. But no, way after, I've never had specific contact. Periodically, I look in a couple of the military magazines where they list reunions at the end. And I look to see, geez, I wonder if anyone's going to write up the 8th Field Hospital or the... I see many more helicopter units that have reunions or naval units. And I just didn't feel like trying to be the chief honcho to develop a reunion group.
Oh, okay.
It's hard enough even in civilian life to get one of those going, to get everybody back together again for reunions, and so I've never really had that. But I have run into other Vietnam veterans. At one time I had veterans plates in Connecticut for my car, and somebody stopped me in the supermarket and says, I was there. I said, oh, well, when and what.
Right.
And it turned out he was one of the troops that got involved in the tunnels of Cu Chi. The underground tunnels that were outside of, well, I don't know all the geographic towns, but outside of Saigon, out in the fields there. And he was involved with the going down into the tunnels, which is now, I think, a big tourist attraction.
Yes. They make money off it now.
Yeah. Where they had, which I thought was fantastic, was that it was so well developed in there that they even had a hospital area, which is exciting to hear that was the potential.
And they filtered the air somehow?
Oh, yeah. I mean, So here I was, you say, well, have I met anyone? Yes, but under different circumstances than just the unit that I was involved
okay.
with. Just
That's a good point.
other veterans.
This is a good time to bring up your cap. If you wear it, you'll have other run-ins, like the license plate. You know what I mean?
All right.
If you wear the cap,
No, but the thing is,
not run-ins, but nice encounters.
and you know what's happening, and that is that as each of these wars has taken its toll, we're finding fewer and fewer World War II veterans. We recently had a luncheon with some from Post 529 of World War II veterans. There are several that are in their late 80s and early 90s. And someday the same thing will be happening with, well, is happening with Korea and Vietnam, and ultimately our current war.
That's true.
So hopefully some of the experiences that each of us have had in all of those situations may be of benefit to the coming generations.
Absolutely. Can you talk? Do you mind? Can you talk about the symbols on your cap? The ribbon and the symbol in the
Well,
middle.
they're symbolic of Vietnam service.
The one in the middle, is that something that's down in D.C., a statue?
I'm going to take my hat off.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, the one in the center, yeah, I'm not sure of whether that's from what that one in the center is, other than the ribbon itself of the red and yellow ribbon is the Vietnam service.
Okay.
The Vietnam service.
And then the one on the right, what is that? The ribbon on the right? All the way?
Right. Well, one of them, I believe, is the national is the service, and the other is
National Defense?
the other is the Vietnam. The green and white
Campaign.
one. The green and white one is the Vietnam service medal.
Did you get the one from New Jersey? There is a Vietnam Service Medal from New Jersey. Well, I gave you the application last time
Yeah,
you were
you
here.
gave me the paper for that. I haven't sent that in because one of them looks like it's for longtime residents of the state
Oh, how long have you lived here?
since 2003. But I think I
it's
am.
5 years I thought you had to live
Oh,
here.
okay, that may be. But
That's the last I remember.
but-
That's interesting. I'll have to look at that.
yeah, but unless we're looking at the ribbons every day and the medals every day, after a while it sort of all sort of blends together. The Bronze Star, which ties up a little bit in the history here, they were awarding the Bronze Star to some of us for service in Vietnam. And at that time, I was assigned to West Point. And one of the moments, the great family moments, was my uncle, who had been a sergeant in the U.S. Army Air Corps, was able to come up to West Point when the commander of the hospital up there presented the Bronze Star Award. So I still have a photograph in my little archives of this particular close relative at the time that someone was acknowledging what I did.
The one who inspired you.
It didn't involve the V pin, the V for valor. This was more for whatever they felt I was doing over there.
What's your uncle's name?
Daniel, same last name.
And
I sent in, you talk about history. I've sent in his bio and photo to the, there's an Army archive. And mine is in there also, as a matter of fact.
In Carlisle?
No, but I sent his bio in.
Oh, in West Point?
No, it's...
The Center for Military History?
Yeah, I think so. So that was kind of an interesting way of wrapping up a little of the history of the military and the family.
Mm-hmm.
My father was exempt because of some hearing disorder that he had,
Mm-hmm.
but that worked out very well.
Mm-hmm.
I hope some of this has been of interest to the Oral History Project.
Yes. Your interview is very educational. No one has a story like you do.
Well, I'm sure there are others that are far more exciting or more hair-raising or whatever. But no, I think that in the long run, those of us who were doing the job, example, at that time in Vietnam, and from what I see and hear about the units and the hospitals today that we have, there's so much work to do when it comes to the care of the troops when they're out there.
Mm-hmm.
And this disaster that they had, we still haven't heard the end of it, of where the Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Frontiers,
Oh, yes.
hospital
Yes.
is bombed and they have over 20 casualties. It gives me the absolute, I guess no better word than just the creeps
Mm-hmm.
of seeing that happen.
And it went
I
on
kept-
for an hour. It wasn't just bombed once, it just was
I
continuously
know,
bombed.
and I kept thinking back about working in a hospital day in and day out, and then have the place bombed,
Mm-hmm.
and then have it by your own troops,
Mm-hmm.
accidental, whatever it was.
It's hard to
But I mean,
even take in.
that still stirs the emotions that
That you
I'm sure
felt
some
after.
of us have, or I certainly got when I saw that.
It reminds me of what you described about how you started feeling in the late 60s about why we were there. You started questioning for the first time the point of even being in Vietnam.
Right.
Right.
But I never sent that letter.
I know, but you know what? I think it probably did you good to get that out on paper. I really think that that in itself is a cathartic experience.
Right.
Just like this is. Sitting here
At
today.
Trinity College, at that time, there was a very big movement against the war at that time.
Mhm. Looking back on your time in service, how do you feel about what you did? What you accomplished?
Well, I'm glad I had the opportunity and the chance to do what I did. And I hope I made a little contribution somewhere along the way.
Mhm. And do you have any kind of message for the next generation about the importance of peace in our world and not to go to war?
Well, I haven't put together my thoughts on that. What I have done, to a small extent, is where I've had a chance to go back through the cycle of saying to a recruiter for the medical corps or for the nurse corps that, and this gets a little away from what you asked about, and to say, if you're interested in practicing nursing or being an optician or a podiatrist or whatever your interest is, if there's a military opportunity to participate and to join and be part of it, I would encourage that, and I always have done that for the longest time. And I have two granddaughters who are now nurses. And no matter what I have said over the long run, neither of them joined the Army Nurse Corps, no matter what I advocated and pushed, saying you'll love it, and it's worthwhile and all that. And so on that side, I still feel that it's a great way to contribute to the future by taking care of people like you would run into in the service, whether it's Marines or Coast Guard or whatever. So that way I feel that it's certainly something to think about. None of my three kids, now all grown and doing their own thing, none of them, in spite of the fact I had them on a short tour at West Point, none of them opted to go into the military and were never drafted. So my batting average within the family thus far, with my own or with the grandchildren, even with saying about JROTC for the high school level and ROTC for the college, none of them opted for that. Well, I think my son might have done it once, started to take a class during his freshman year and got a pair of boots, but then never went beyond that. So, and as far as peace and trying to develop a generation that is going to make some headway, I just don't know. And you see when I see what's going on in the news every day,
right,
whether it's the situation in Paris with terrorism, or on trains in Sweden, or in shooting up a museum where there were tourists at a museum in Tunisia.
right.
Remember that? They
I
were
do
coming
remember
off
that.
a ship for a routine cruise, like we've all done. You want to go to a museum, and you see this in people, whatever the country, wherever that this is happening. How in the world you can advocate for peace, but who's listening? Who's going to do something? That's what I haven't got my hands around that, or my head around it. If somebody does, let me know.
Sometimes they say peace starts in the family. If each family can find peace, then maybe the world can find peace.
Maybe. But if you're in the family in Tunisia, when someone racks off the automatic weapon, or someone's running around with a knife in the Palestinian Israeli area, you're right, it does start with the family, but some are it seems to me, some are so indoctrinated in their ways, in their thoughts, from the little kids. Some of these, you've probably seen it, where they're in some of the African countries and some of the others, they have 9, 10, 11-year-old kids with the bullets strapped around their chests for machine gun. And where is it starting in that family? And what is that family got in the first place that got them to where they are?
Right.
The hatreds and the
violence.
I don't know. I haven't gotten a grip on that. Maybe you'll inspire me now to think more about it, but I don't know.
Have you ever spoken about your time in service to any of the school groups or anything? Have your grandchildren, or have you gone
they've
to the
asked.
schools?
I've had calls from them sometime on Veterans Day, and which has been very nice. when I was at West Point, I gave a class, the only time I can say that I was on the temporary faculty at West Point. I gave a class to a group of cadets on my experience in Vietnam.
Really?
And put together a handout and a few photographs. And
You gave a lecture? It was a one-day class?
yeah.
Okay.
But it was only once because I think they had some class on Vietnam and the Vietnamese language. And
because they might have been going over there?
yeah, that's very likely. That was another difficult experience, by the way, and I know we're in a way jumping around a little bit on some of these thoughts, but there were a number of funerals at West Point while we were there. And those were some of those that were returning, that had graduated, young lieutenants and whatever.
Right.
That was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
Because at the time of graduation, I happened to be, when I got assigned there was one graduation, and then it carried over till the next time. And of course the weddings go on there.
The cross swords.
And the cross swords and all that. And we see it from afar because we're not invited as wedding guests or anything. But to see the young families or the young spouses come back for that was not easy. Because there's a cemetery right on the grounds of West Point.
Oh, okay.
So, see many aspects of all of this, really, when I think back about it.
In '72, we stopped sending troops over.
Yeah, I think the final flag came down in, 75?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to look up periodically just to refresh my memory on the sequence there. I was once in Washington for a meeting of the Reserve Officers Association, and I went to the headquarters of the NRA, which was in Washington at the time. I think they moved out somewhere else. And I was looking around at the obviously the gun collection in their museum that they have there, which is fantastic if you ever get a chance to visit. And someone said, "Major Mittelmann?" And I look around, and it was my interpreter.
Oh.
Who had been, she was devoted to our 8th Field Hospital. There was one other one also.
Oh.
Academically, she was, I don't know what level she was at, but she was excellent, and she was absolutely bilingual. And her name was Kimsa, K-I-M-S-A. I turn around, and there's Kimsa. And I had never hugged her before, nor did she ever hug me.
Right.
But it was like an old-time reunion.
It's beautiful. Wow.
Of an interpreter. She came over with you asked about the end of the last years of the war. She came over with one of the, I don't know, the Vietnamese boat people. I don't recall now exactly how she arrived here. I think she landed in Houston, where a lot of Vietnamese people were coming in to that city, and maybe some others. But she got a job. She's obviously, well-spoken in
Right.
English and a knowledgeable woman. So she got a job as one of the staff of the NRA. And she had an apartment in Washington, somewhere near DuPont Circle. I may have met her again once on another trip to the reserve officers meeting. I don't know now. But we kept in touch over the next few years. Excuse me. And she told me about, she had made a trip back after all this time, somewhere in the mid-'80s or late '80s. She made a trip back to Nha Trang, where she was from, and where we were in the 8th Field Hospital, and went up to Hanoi and then back, and wonderful lady, and never married, never had a family. We stayed in touch for a while, exchanged Christmas cards, and then she passed away a few years ago. I forgot what her particular problem was. But that was a strange, you asked earlier about a follow-up of knowing anybody who happened to be at the hospital at the time, and to run into her at least 10 years later, probably. No,
77?
it would have been even further. This would have been well into the 80s. To see her at the NRA building, working there, full-time employment.
Things happen for a reason that you went there, right?
Never know.
I'm curious, did she have family in Nha Trang? Did she have people, or maybe friends?
Well, I assume she had friends, but I never knew anything really about her background or anything. But she was the one that accompanied, would take me out to the Leprosarium and act as the interpreter there. We went to several historical monuments, some of the Buddhist temples together. She showed me around Nha Trang in that way. So that was a very, very strange coincidence about running into somebody from there. But when I heard that, somebody calling my name out in the middle of the NRA building.
And your rank. Major.
She didn't know I'd moved up a little way, but so that's...
It's interesting. I did want to ask you, had you ever gone back to any of the locations where you were?
That opportunity, that could have happened, but I never did. In the reserve unit that I was at the 819 Station Hospital, I had an executive officer there who, his wife had been a nurse in Vietnam. And long after our assignments changed around, she called me, he called me, and they had been part of a group that was going to go back to Vietnam.
Okay.
And there have been several of those, but I never did. I would like to. I would like to, particularly if someone like the hospital chief of the Provincial Hospital or one of those military doctors was around. But I kind of don't think maybe that they are around, and especially when North Vietnam took over all of that area, whether some of these people were lost as a result of having participated or, in quotes, collaborated with us. So I never felt that I wanted to do that.
Mm-hmm. What about San Antonio? Did you ever go back there?
Yes.
Oh.
I went back on, there's a program called ESGR, Employer Support of Guard and Reserve. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
ESGR. And we had a very active group in Connecticut for ESGR. And they run flights or trips to, or let's say, in this instance, there was a trip going to San Antonio to visit the military facilities in San Antonio. Lackland Air Force Base, Brooks Airfield, Brooke General Hospital. And I was invited to go. all expenses paid, whatever. And so I had a trip back there, and they had a meeting in one of the small auditoriums of the old hospital, which is no longer functional, big brand new hospital, which I have not seen. So I'm sitting in this auditorium listening to somebody present something. All of our group is together, and one of my colleagues raises his hand, and at some point where there were questions or answers, and he says, you know, Dr. Mittelmann used to sit here when he was a resident here in orthopedics in the late 1950s, early 60s.
Oh.
So there I was, thinking I'm in another world now and forgetting about all of this stuff. And here he
Points you
It
out.
was like old home week. You know, to be sitting in that little auditorium. It was a small auditorium for presentations on different things. So yes, I had a tour there, Lackland Air Force Base, and all of that's now one big composite joint base now, which I have not seen.
Have you gone back to West Point?
Yeah, I made a couple of trips there for retired. Every year there's an annual retiree services. Sometimes call it RSO, or different names they have for retirees to come and have a day of a meeting, listen to a presentation about what's going on. So I had a chance to visit the new, I call it new, but the hospital there. They're probably wanting to replace that because they must consider it old. To me, it's the new hospital.
It's a different
They call it
hospital.
Keller Army Hospital is the name that they use there. So I've had a couple of trips back there for the retiree days,
That's nice.
and still looks good.
That's
Still
great.
looks great. We have a parade, and it's great.
You did a great job here today, Colonel.
Well, you've asked a lot of questions, which got me thinking again.
Good.
All right.
I want to say I'm honored and humbled that you came here today to speak to me of your sacrifice and contribution that you made in service to our country. Thank you. God bless you. Welcome home.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Carol.